Hi, my name is Andy Bennett. I'm Vice President of Technologies and CISO for Apollo Information Systems, and I'm here presenting with CrowdStrike. And I used to be with the government, and I'm here to help. We're here to talk about zero trust, and more specifically, we're here to talk about why you should trust no one, nothing, always continuously validate. It's not just marketing, even though you're going to see and hear a lot of marketing, and probably already have, about this topic. Zero trust is being seen everywhere, from credit card industries to hospitals to average enterprises to product marketing materials. You're seeing zero trust everywhere. But the thing is people make assertions about what zero trust is, and they make claims that they can just solve all your zero trust issues when you don't even have zero trust issues. You have zero trust goals. These words don't mean what they think they mean. You got to watch out for the buzzwords, the BS that the marketecture, the marketing engines, and the hype research firms are going to put out there, have put out there, and will continue to put out there. See, the thing is you'll see very excited people talking about zero trust, and they'll wave their arms in the air, which normally on stage I would have, but they'll wave their arms in the air, they'll be very excited, and they will tell you that zero trust will solve all your problems. They'll talk about the zero trust approach, and they'll say ZTA. They'll talk about zero trust architecture, and they'll use the same acronym, ZTA. They'll talk about ZTNA, which you might have assumed would be another architecture, but it's actually zero trust network access. And then they'll work that into a discussion on SASE, because SASE is the latest buzzword. It's the latest architecture that could solve a lot of problems if it's achievable in any given organization. And it's what's trying to bring zero trust forward from where it was first conceived of over a decade ago into practice now. But unfortunately, it's fallen into focus right there with Synergy and the 119 other most hated buzzwords in business today. And hopefully you've had time to read the paragraph at the bottom, which is nothing but buzzwords and talking about the issues we're facing today. So what does it actually all mean? Well, it means that we have to shift from an old model. In the old model where we have the perimeter, we're protecting the perimeter, and we're building our moats, and we're securing our castle, and we're working through defense in depth. The problem is that is a system-centric, location-based model in practice in most places. And so what that means is we trust everything that's on the inside and trust nothing that's on the outside, and we don't ever change that model. So it's a negative security model where you believe that everything in the environment is good, and when you identify something that's not good, you reach in and you pull it out, you blacklist it. Now, I think blacklist is great for TV. It's not a good security model moving forward into the cloud when you've got dynamic approaches, dynamic systems that scale and burst and have all sorts of unpredictable behaviors. And so we also have a problem where inside these trusted, implicitly trusted environments, communication is wide open. You don't have anything making sure that systems aren't sending passwords in the clear. You don't have anything making sure that every single connection is secured, and that if a threat actor, if a bad guy, could get in there and listen to your traffic, that they couldn't just completely devastate your environment. And that's the problem with a system-centric, location-based approach, which is why we're moving to the zero trust approach, which means trust no one by default, meaning there is no implied or implicit trust. It doesn't matter that you came in from the inside. It doesn't matter that you are on an agency-owned asset or laptop workstation. In Zero Trust, the workstations and whatnot are called assets. And you take a positive approach where you assume that everything in the environment is bad, and you only whitelist what should be allowed. It's actually a very old approach to things, and the military adopted it a long time ago in a lot of circles, and it's deny all, permit by exception. You only let what should be in your environment work in your environment, as opposed to letting everybody in and trying to get the bad guys out. It requires a shift to an identity-centric approach, and that identity-centric approach can represent some of those challenges, but we're going to talk through some of them. So when you get past the buzzwords and you need to find an objective standard, a place to start from that is based in practice and not in product, that is based in general applicability and how to get organizations moving in the right direction. Well, in government we have long been under and following NIST, and so NIST is a great place to start. NIST went ahead and grabbed this ball and started developing a standard around zero trust because the hype engine got so big that they finally decided that it was time for a standard. So NIST Special Publication 800-207 is where you can find those details, and it's where you will find that they've distilled it to its simplest form. Oppenheimer said that if you understand anything well enough, you can describe it in 3 points. When asked whether or not he could explain quantum mechanics in 3 points, he said, no, we don't understand it. And so NIST, however, does understand it, and they were able to put together this 3-point model that you see here on the slides, where the asset enters in an untrusted zone and in an untrusted way, and there's no location. There's no location, there's no perimeter, there's no, we got inside the data center. There's assets, policy decision points, and enforcement points, followed by the resource. And the resource is the database, the application server, the compute, literally anything you're trying to do or get access to inside your environment. And that simple model is the guidepost for what zero trust is in actual practice. So since you probably don't want to go and read the whole document, I'm going to break down the key tenets of the document for you. And for NIST, in Special Publication 800-207, there are some key takeaways here. And I'm not going to read the sentences to you, I'm going to read the takeaways for you, which is nothing in your environment is out of scope when you go full zero trust. When you dive into this and you commit to it, nothing is out of scope. You have to have no way to circumvent these controls that you're going to put in place. Otherwise, it's almost zero trust, not actual zero trust. It's mostly don't trust, not actual don't trust. So nothing is out of scope. The other thing is you have to make sure that all communications are secured. And for a lot of organizations, this can be challenging because there are some use cases where communications were in the clear for previously valid system reasons. But as you move into the future and combat future threats, those open lines of communication represent data sources for the bad guys with minimally returning benefits for us. The next thing is no persistence, which means when you go into a system and you log into that system, right now you may be able to bounce in and out of that system without being challenged again for authentication, without being revalidated, without having any kind of monitoring of that connection, because you were you when you went in and your credential was good, and so that access was allowed to persist over time for up to a long time. In one incident that I've worked, we ran into a situation where the threat actor had actually been in the environment for up to a year. We actually don't know how long they'd been in the environment, and so long that the account they were actually using had been disabled in the main directory services for over 180 days, and yet the access persisted because the settings were configured in such a way to let that happen. In a zero trust model, all of that has to be turned off all the way down to the end of the current session. You have to disable it and force some validation. There are ways to make sure that your users aren't absolutely frustrated at every turn trying to get into the systems, and to smooth out the login process from a user experience standpoint by monitoring other characteristics. But you cannot have persistence and achieve zero trust. And getting access right now in a zero trust model, just because your last session was allowed to get access, or just because you authenticated well and checked out good at the beginning and received your access, doesn't mean that something doesn't change in the middle of that session. That continuously we're monitoring, and if we see some bad behavior, it's time to revoke that session. It's time to end that session. Getting access now does not have to and cannot in zero trust imply future access. It has to be revalidated every single time. The last 3 tenets here are that the environment's always changing, right? That's one of the drivers of zero trust. The environment is not predictable. We don't know who or what should necessarily be in there. If we've got rapidly scalable systems that are doing their rapidly scaling thing, then we will not be able to have a full inventory of everything that would always be in the environment. So we have to instead watch the environment and watch for changes that are unexpected, watch for changes that are out of the normal. In a zero trust environment, we are always watching for these changes. We have to watch for changes changes that are out of character. In a web service that is intended to scale and goes from very few processes to 100,000 processes very quickly every day at lunchtime, that's a normal behavior. And we can identify that and track that as a normal behavior. And we won't flag a bursting service at lunchtime as an issue. Especially if it's serving out web pages as expected, and that's another thing that we can monitor. However, if that same system, instead of bursting, starts to blast out communications from relatively few processes that have never run in that environment before, well, that's a big red flag, and it's probably time to shut that down. That's the kind of telemetry we're going to be looking for, which is we're going to need to get all of the telemetry and allow for no exceptions. And I covered no exceptions on the last slide, but it's one of the core tenets separately and standalone. Everything in the environment has to go through these processes. Every user, every system, every resource has to be subject to the authentication, access, authorization, mediations of a policy engine and decision point that help you dynamically provision access. It is not the same as the old model. All of the telemetry that you can get will help feed this model is the last and most important point in terms of tracking and understanding the dynamicness of the environment. You have to make sure you get as much information as possible and figure out how to integrate it into your decision engines. So zero trust architecture, and zero trust network access. That's what these have started to come to mean, ZTA and ZTNA. And if you think about them, zero trust is the concept. ZTNA is the architecture, it's the reference architectures, and we're going to cover a couple of those. And then ZTNA is the actual practice. It's the network access that is governed, mediated, and secured through a zero trust approach. And so some of the challenges, one, this is incredibly intimidating. When you first get into approaching, how am I going to move my environment into zero trust? How am I going to get people to buy in? Is it going to have a lot of friction? Is it going to be hard to deploy? Is it going to be successful in my environment? And those are not easy questions to answer. It can be a lot of work, but it doesn't have to be, none of it is undoable. It is all achievable. And so the first challenge that a lot of organizations identify is the dynamic access control. And there are tools you can bolt on, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But you have to have the ability to apply conditional access controls inside your environment to be able to achieve zero trust. Because if you don't have some sort of engine or some sort of policy enforcement ability, you aren't able to achieve zero trust, even if you have all of the other structures, all of the other information that you need. In order to enforce it, though, you have to know who you're enforcing against, and that means identity. And identity has been identified as the new perimeter. But unfortunately, that's not a new topic. People keep talking about it like it's a new topic, but if you notice, there's an article on the slides that is from 2013. Dark reading, where they said, identity is the new perimeter. There's also one from a couple weeks ago on those slides that says, identity is the new perimeter. So it's just taking us a long time to get out there to that new perimeter. Identity is the core of a zero trust approach, and you have to consider how you're going to handle it. The thing is that you already have these tools in your environment. You already have the starting blocks. You already have logins. You already have IDs. And you have to then start to move towards leveraging the power of the identities that are already in your system. I'm calling it a move from defense in depth to a defense in authenticate and authorize in depth. And that's what you need to think of. Quit thinking of the firewall as the perimeter. Think about the things that you can validate and use as control points proactively as the perimeter. Let's stop them before they get to the gate. So, where do we start? Where do we get moving on our zero trust journey? Well, we got to start with identity. I just said it was the core, and that's where you start. You have to understand your identities. You have to start with the fundamentals, and then you can get fancy, because there's a lot of fancy tools, a lot of fancy approaches, a lot of fancy techniques that you can adopt, use, implement to get to the end of your zero trust road. The first and foremost thing, and we've all heard it, we've been preaching it, we've been told it, we've told our leadership it, leadership has asked us why we don't have it, while at the same time sometimes not wanting to adopt it. Multi-factor authentication. Having more than one way to know that your user is your user and not somebody else posing as your user is an absolutely business critical, process critical, security critical function to achieve in your environment. Having more than one factor for authentication is critical, and it's not just for your system admins. It's not just for people who start with privileged access. It's for users who need access in your environment, and that access, if co-opted by a threat actor, could be escalated, could be changed if we're not continuously leveraging the power of identity to make sure that we lock that threat actor out of the environment. So I've spent a lot of time just focused on MFA here because it is that important. The next thing is cyber hygiene. And cyber hygiene is a fun buzzword in cybersecurity. We're trying to communicate out to other folks. It's like washing our hands. It's like daily hygiene in our lives. But cyber hygiene, in the case of identity, specifically here, it's not just maintaining your environment. It's strong passwords. It's user-based cyber hygiene. Strong passwords, enforced password rotation, making sure those passwords expire on a regular schedule, and if you're not expiring passwords, making sure those passwords meet the NIST guidelines for passwords that don't expire, specifically the very long passwords that are nearly impossible to guess. There are ways to still to remain secure while helping your users overcome the friction of the transition to these new systems. And the other thing is you have to be willing to lock people and resources and assets out if something looks bad. And the organization is going to have to accept that sometimes that happens. As we get good, as we get better, as we get best at zero trust and it's fully implemented, fully operationalized, the false positive lockouts will get down to near zero, if not actual zero. And we will only be locking out actual malicious behavior. But at the start of the journey, there are going to be likely to be some false positives, and you're also going to have, because the change has been made in the environment and change is hard, you're going to have users who don't understand why they have to do something different because it has always worked. And we know in security that that's not necessarily a great place to start, but that doesn't change the opinion from users and leadership, and it's our job to communicate the need to them around this. The next thing is for the privileged access. For those privileged users, start to consider using PAM. Use conditional access to achieve privileged access management if you can't bolt on a separate tool for privileged access management. Then go beyond the user. Everything we've talked about so far just now was about the user, but remember that there are service accounts, there are system connections, there are all kinds of other things that take action inside your environment, and so you have to go into those too. Cyber hygiene has to go into that. You have to make sure that you're managing the cryptographic keys. You have to make sure that you have some sort of secrets management approach, if not a platform. You need to make sure that your services and your infrastructure are in scope. Remember, first tenet, nothing is out of scope. The last thing here is you need to figure out how you're going to leverage the telemetry you get from behavior. You're going to need to figure out what behaviors are good and okay and what behaviors are not. And there are lots of tools out there that can help you using machine learning, AI, and lots of super secret squirrel snake oil sauce help you come up with the answers to the behavior question. But you already have access to a whole lot of data that could help you with that already in your identity systems, in your Active Directories, in your cloud-based identities. You have the tools to get started, and later on you can get fancy. So, authenticate, authorize, and then continuously validate. The first two make sense, right? We already log in and make sure we know who we are. And okay, it's not a big leap to move towards role-based access or conditional role-based access where we we reassert our access to a given resource at the time of authentication. But continuously validating means continuously monitoring. And yes, it means continuous, ongoing. You can't stop watching just because somebody has proven who they were at the start of the connection. If that session gets hijacked, we need to figure out how to identify that and lock out the hijacker from the session. Attributes to consider: track, measure, and use in your zero trust approach. I've listed a whole bunch of them here, but this is not an exhaustive list. Read through this list, see what you have. You have user identity. Your users log in somehow, and you have logs from that. You have the attributes in the user profile. You've got organizational units. You've got all kinds of structural data items that you can use to track what the users do and identify negative behaviors. And if you don't have a UEBA engine in your environment, as many of us don't, to do that for you, you can start to script that out. And you should start to script that out. And even if it doesn't take automated action to start with, it should send you an alert. You should script it to where it sends you an alert so that you can identify bad behavior. And over time, you can move towards automation, move towards a fully mature zero trust implementation. But you can also consider your endpoints and their hardware type. If you are a Lenovo customer or a Dell customer, and all of a sudden you end up with a whole bunch of HPs who are also, maybe consider location, not in your state, well, maybe they shouldn't be on your network. Or maybe they're contractors and we still should go back and consider identity and monitor everything. Physical location is another item, as I just said. Firmware versions, check them. If you have if you know what your firmware version should be, or more importantly, if your threat intel, your vulnerability management tell you that a certain firmware version is vulnerable to remote takeover at the core system level, at the bare metal, well then maybe that's something you should know, something you should track. And if you know that you've updated all the firmware in your environment and all of a sudden you see one of those, it's time to flag that system and call it in, call that user. Use your vulnerability management, keep track of your applications, and make sure that you're also feeding back your threat intel and your security incidents. We all track our incidents, we all manage our incidents. Feed that stuff back into this, because the more data you can feed into your zero trust approach, the more likely you are to proactively stop the threat actor before they can actually do damage in your environment. So, you say, I don't know how to do this. Well, there are lots of folks out there who have worked very hard to come up with ways for you to do this. And so you can bolt on a lot of tools. There's a lot of products out there that will tell you, we achieve zero trust. We provide zero trust. And the really good ones are saying, we support zero trust. We help you deliver zero trust. You'll also see a lot of the differentiators being described as, we help you deploy easily, because deployment pain is very real and can be incredibly difficult in trying to achieve zero trust. You will also see zero trust approaches that only cover specific technologies. We're going to cover one here in just a little bit. It only covers specific technologies. It won't cover your whole environment. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You have to start somewhere. There's lots of things to bolt on, but there's no silver bullet. There's no one product that can cover 100% of your enterprise, unless you're just going to outsource that and let them choose the products and consider that a one and done. And even then, you still can't outsource the responsibility for the success of those systems. You can outsource the technical, the technical tasks. You can outsource the operations, but at the end of the day, responsibility and accountability for the results of those programs still rests with us at the organizations. Sorry. So let's talk about where this stuff is working in practice. Let's talk through some case studies here. If you go back and you read the headlines from the last 6 years or so, or you can even go back to 2013 if you want to have some fun, and you can see there's been a lot of compromises out there that have resulted from easy to fix, easy to avoid problems. It's the fundamentals that end up getting people front, left, and center. And it's because our systems allow those fundamentals to be ignored. Implicit trust is one of the biggest flaws that allow those things to happen. So for example, when a system administrator spins up an open S3 bucket and dumps 100% of our sensitive PII from our constituents into that storage bucket, nothing stopped it. Nothing tracked it. Nothing said, oh, this person doesn't normally work on systems and this data. Maybe we should throw a flag and have somebody check on this. Or it says, this is sensitive data, and the permissions over here, when we tried to validate the security posture of this storage, it didn't meet our standards. That can be very difficult to achieve, but is absolutely critical to find a way to enforce the fundamentals in our environment, to make sure that the systems we stand up, the storage we use, the web applications that go live, any new system in our environment, any old system in our environment, to make sure that they are meeting our standards so that we can provide the right assurances to our constituents and our customers. So let's talk about insider threat. There's an easy one to go after, and that is Mr. Snowden. Mr. Snowden, as everybody knows, was a contractor at the NSA, and what some people may not know, they know what he did. They know he exfilled a whole lot of information. He's the poster child for an insider threat. Regardless of how you feel about what he did, the way he did it should give you pause for concern as a security professional, because the way he did it was he borrowed passwords. Yes, he did compromise and appropriate some accounts, and he did go above and beyond just asking the person next to him for a password, but in some cases, that's literally what he did. He asked colleagues for their password, borrowed their access, and used their access that went beyond his or had access to things he did not, and to cover his tracks a little, to do the things he was doing, to do the things he should not be allowed to do. Why was he able to do that? Didn't they take their security training? You never share your password. Except familiarity breeds contempt. And in this particular case, it didn't breed contempt for each other. It bred contempt for the rules, because these people were locked in one of the highest security facilities in the nation. They were in a SCIF all the time, doing highly classified work. They all passed the same intense background checks. So how could the guy sitting next to you possibly be bad? How could Ed be bad? I know Ed. Ed's a good guy. I know Ed's wife. She's nice. Except intentions are not something that you can tell just because you sit next to somebody every single day. And you also can't rely on people's best intentions. You can't rely on people's behavior or that everybody else has the same approach to loyalty that you do. And so when following the rules, if you make the rules impossible to break or very difficult to break, it becomes very difficult to steal the information, to compromise our systems. And so zero trust could have absolutely stopped the majority of what Edward Snowden did, or at the least bit, it could have slowed him down to the point where he might have gotten caught before the information went out into the wild. The next thing is rogue cloud assets. This is one of my favorites because sysadmins, and I used to be one, but sysadmins sometimes, they want to just do it live. Let's just get this done. There's no reason to wait. And so in the cloud, there's never been a better opportunity, or has it been easier to just do it live, right? You can just spool that thing up, that resource can be live. I can deploy a system and be done. I can start at 3 and be ready for my break by 3:30, and I have stood up an entirely domain-connected system, done all kinds of things, and it's the cloud. So what's the harm? If I need to test something, why don't I just spin it up, test my thing, and spin it down? Well, the thing is, if you spin it up and you're not following proper governance and you're not following the standards, if your organization doesn't have standards, maybe start there. But if you're not following the standards for deploying assets in your organization, then maybe you're missing something that should have been there, such as, security controls. Far too often, these cloud assets get stood up without going through actual controls, and they end up open to the internet, because that's one of the default settings in most cloud providers, because that's how you get to these systems, and it starts with default credentials. And if you don't remember to change those credentials, they're still there. And then if you are standing up a Windows virtual machine, for example, in a cloud environment with default credentials, and you join it to your domain without removing and or changing those default credentials on the local machine, since it's a cloud instance, the threat actors are scanning cloud environments for new instances all the time. In the particular case that I'm using as the background for my story here, the threat actors took less than 10 minutes to identify the open target once it had been joined on the domain and open to the wild. And they compromised a government agency in another state very quickly, and that compromise took 2 months to overcome. The same exact thing has happened in multiple cities in high-profile attacks, and in each case, it was a system opened up with default credentials in a cloud environment that the threat actors were able to find, leverage, and pivot into the main network. And in the cases I'm using as the back, because I'm trying not to use actual names of victims. I don't want to victim shame without adding value. And so you probably are all very familiar with who I'm using as these cases, but it cost a lot of time, millions of dollars, and for some of these cities, operations have never been really restored. They've lost years, up to a decade of information in some departments that will never be recovered. It's gone. Criminal court cases had to be thrown out because the evidence was just gone. Local water bills. People don't think about the water department as being a critical IT asset right up until they have no idea how much you owe and or whether or not you paid to have your service restored if your water had been cut off and then nobody shows up to turn your water back on. It starts to get pretty critical in those cases, and that's pretty deep and feels like a really downer moment, but it's very real. And so zero trust as an approach is one of the few ways that all of these attacks could be stopped. Because if we don't trust that new asset as it comes online until it meets our security needs, if we're validating that, if we're watching those configurations, scanning it for vulnerabilities, continuously monitoring the state of that system, and we would have known which user stood up that resource, we would not have to worry as much about that behavior and about that system going live in the wild, because it would meet the standards, the default credentials would be changed, and the threat actors would have to work a lot harder. It doesn't mean that they'll never get into your environment again, and you should assume that they're already there. You should assume that they actually are in the environment, and you should take every step you can to limit and eliminate their ability to do bad things in your environment, to do things that you don't want them doing in your environment. Assume you're compromised, because as we have gone outside the perimeter, as we have started working from home, as we've started working from Starbucks, because how do we know where you're working from? As people are coming in and out of the office, on and off the local network, as they come in through a VPN and all of a sudden are wide open, we have to assume that the threat actors are following them in. And we need to take the actions necessary to ensure that we're limiting their ability to do bad things. So since we're assuming compromise, context becomes everything. How do we find that compromise? Relies on the telemetry and all those other things that we've already talked about. So now we've come full circle in our discussion. Let's make it practical. Here we have my very technical flowchart that tells you everything you need to know about zero trust. But what it actually is just a little more nuanced than the NIST model, because the yellow represents all the data feeds and telemetry, the green represents the access requests, blue represents the actual decision point across the request and the access. And please notice that unless I missed one, every single point on this diagram has telemetry coming out of it, because there's something useful in every single piece of your environment. Every connected resource, every identity, every asset in your environment provides useful telemetry to figure out if there's a threat actor in the environment. Context is key, and it's what you need to feed your dynamic controls. But I have listed a couple solutions that can help you do that in this slide, but let's move on to a more detailed, frankly more professional reference architecture. So the previous slide was a process, a visualization for how it works. This is how you do it. Following this right here will get you a lot farther than this 3-point definition and allow you to start putting your own vendors or your own current in-place technologies into each one of these buckets. And I've come up with an example for exactly how you can do that, because what's important is to get started. And you start with what you have. This is the Microsoft approach, and I'm well aware that the vast majority of state agencies have Microsoft technologies in their environment. The weakness in this approach is that it solves for Microsoft. And so many state agencies have non-Microsoft assets, have cloud environments that this won't cover, have lots of technologies, lots of SaaS services, lots of other things out there that would fall outside of this architecture. But Microsoft has provided a model for how to leverage the tools you probably already have to start on your zero trust journey, to start working towards zero trust and getting conditional access in place that can dynamically allow and revoke access to specific resources across your environment, depending on the telemetry you're getting. And you have to start somewhere. You might as well start with what you have and then get fancy, like I said. The key takeaway here, the number one thing I want everyone to know is that, yes, you can do this. You absolutely can do this. Start anywhere you can. I've given you a couple of places where you can start. Try the Microsoft approach. If you have some of the partners I listed, bring them in. If you have other partners, bring them in. Ask them how they can help support you in doing this. Work with DIR. Work with anybody across your organization to figure out what other tools might be in your environment to get this going. Start now, because 80% of all breaches across the world of successful attacks could be stopped with this, leaving us only 20% to handle. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to our partners over at CrowdStrike for inviting me in to talk to you guys. I used to be with the government. I'm here to help. And please submit your questions. Let's have a conversation. So the first question we've got right up here at the top was about the executive order, the President Biden's executive order that is directed at federal agencies and federal government, the area of his influence. And I've also been asked to tell everybody before I finish this answer that we have a hard stop. The system will cut us off at 12. So if I'm in the middle of an answer and disappear, and you really wanted the end of that answer, just shoot me an email or a message in the conference system. I'll be here most of the rest of the day. So President Biden's executive order is directed at federal agencies. That's the sphere of influence for his direct authority. And he has directed those agencies to take a number of steps towards cybersecurity. Now, given the timing, you might think that this was a response to the Colonial Pipeline attack, but that's more of an accident of timing than it is an actual correlation. They've actually been working on this executive order for months, and it is more of a response to the supply chain attacks at SolarWinds than it is the Colonial Pipeline. But Colonial Pipeline provided that last impetus and a sense of urgency to actually get it promulgated. And so in the executive order, relevant to this discussion, there's a lot of cybersecurity mandates in there, but the thing that jumps out at most people in their first reading is that every federal agency is now mandated to move to a zero trust and to adopt and implement zero trust architectures, services, et cetera, as a core pillar of their approach to securing public information. And so on the military, on the defense industrial base side, there's already been a big push towards systems that would imply zero trust, but it hasn't been explicitly required. And now with this new executive order, it's explicitly required. The next part of this question, it was a two-part question, is what are the likely downstream impacts of that? And the downstream impacts of that are going to be twofold. One is you might actually see a lessening of rigid requirements like system security plans and checklists and audits and stuff like that, because the whole point of moving towards a zero trust is to be able to interact with third parties without having to trust them, to where the only data that can enter their system from your connection is the data that is relevant to the business. The only processes that can take place are those processes that are relevant to the business and are expected and validated. And instead of trusting one document over a long period of time for the duration of the relationship between audits and only double checking it if there's been an incident,
they're moving towards a continuous validation model where every time these systems connect, every time a new session begins, instead of having just a persistent allow, they're having a dynamic and continuous revalidation of that access. And so we may actually see an interesting change where it becomes easier to deal with. However, if they follow suit against the defense industrial base, the steps that they have taken is any requirement for the data that are being handled at the federal level are now passing down to 100% of the supply chain that feed into those things. And so for defense industrial base suppliers, they now have to, every single sub supplier that feeds into that loop has to meet the same standards as the top level. And so if they adopt that approach and they leverage the CMMC work that's happening on the defense side as part of the execution of this executive order, then the downstream implications for data sharing will be absolutely huge. All right, so the next question is, if my organization was to implement a software-defined perimeter in order to make accessing my applications more efficient, what should I ask vendors providing that service? I gave some answers in the chat on the other side, and what I left off and held for here is identity, identity, identity. If you're looking to adopt this and use one, as I said, you have to do it across your entire enterprise. You can't have exceptions. Now, when you start somewhere, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Start somewhere and document what is out of scope for the first implementation so that you can monitor it, so your security team can give it extra attention and monitoring. but beyond that, ask them how they integrate with the data sources, how they handle, receive, and process the telemetry, how their policy engine enables you to define what circumstances are good and what circumstances are bad, and what circumstances are alertable but not revocable for access, etc. Find out how granular your ability is to fine tune your zero trust implementation, because if you recall from those diagrams in the presentation, the critical pivot points for a zero trust architecture are those central policy engines and policy decision points that actually mediate the access. Scrolling down. Where's the best place to start if you're not familiar? I tried to make this presentation a great place to start, so come back and get this presentation. I provided the slides over as well, so they may have those. Feel free to rip that off. But the next best place to start is to start with your existing stack. Go and ask your vendors, ask your providers, because you aren't risking procurement issues or anything like that. Go ask them how they support a move towards zero trust, where they fit in a move towards zero trust. And just be ready. Some of your vendors will have good answers. Other of your vendors will feed you BS because they don't understand it either. And so be ready to have that discussion, listen with a critical ear, and just start asking questions. That's where you start. It doesn't matter where you start, just start. And the game code is in there, just in case you're doing that. We have 1 minute left. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. If you come up with questions afterwards, like we always do, please feel free to reach out. Andy at apollo-is.com. You can also reach out to Sean and the CrowdStrike team. They know how to get a hold of me. And it's great to see everybody. And they're going to cut me off in approximately 30 seconds. So if anybody has any last second questions to drop in the chat, drop it on.
No questions, Andy. Just want to say thanks for a good session. Good to see you.
Bet. Good to see everybody. Hope it was valuable.
It was.
Awesome. And thanks for CrowdStrike for giving me the opportunity. Oh. Are you seeing more success?
How fast can you talk?
Let's find out.
Firewall.
I'm seeing a lot of success in the integration capabilities of the next generation firewalls to feed telemetry into these systems, but you still need a policy engine to do it. And we didn't get cut off, it looks like. So you still need a policy engine to do it. Next generation firewalls don't discreetly provide you that capability. And so you still have to have some other conditional access engine that that feeds into that the next generation firewall can feed its telemetry into, and that you can feed the identity system, you can feed the IDPS system, you can feed in network logs, application logs, whatever you've got, feed it all into that policy engine. Anything that policy engine can be integrated with and can receive, do it. Anybody else? Because apparently it's not going to cut us off till 12:05. We were wrong. I can sit here in silence between two ferns, but it's very difficult for me. So the last thing I would say is I know that most of you have Microsoft infrastructure, and I provided a diagram that I pulled directly from Microsoft's tech resources on how to implement Zero Trust using your Microsoft core infrastructure and get to a conditional access model that that gives you the foundation for Zero Trust using Microsoft as the engine. Since you already have it, it makes a great place to start and provides a good foundation. It may not reach all of your systems depending on what you've got. It's hard to say, for example, unless you've done the intense work it takes to tie your Active Directory to your Solaris systems, then or to your mainframe, then you may still have those left outstanding that you might have to have other tooling for. But it can solve for it can solve 80% and leave you 20% to focus on. So check that out and use it as a good place to start. We'll go ahead and just wait for another question. And John Scarab, you always have something. What you got? Or Jeremy, do you have something? We have 3 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, if no one else has another question. So you brought up the Microsoft slide, and it very well depicts how you secure Microsoft applications. And so I guess, that can be an authoritative source for users. We have a project you might be familiar with we're working on where customers are trying to make decisions on whether they want to integrate Active Directory or some other source with ours. So obviously there's some challenges and some pros and cons if you go down the Active Directory path or do not. So just kind of wondering your thoughts on that, as I know some customers are out there contemplating as they're looking at various identity solutions.
So there's a ton of identity solutions out there, and the right one is the one that meets your need and your budget. Some of the newer identity providers, and I'll throw a name because it's the industry standard when you think of these things, but Okta, but also OneLogin, Ping, ID.me. There's all sorts of alternative identity sources out there separate from Active Directory that are the modern attempt to provide an easy button against identity. And most of them are easily integrated or have a focus on easy integration. And they have pretty open APIs where you can get the telemetry, but they do have limitations. So there's a cost to everything. And sometimes when you make a move to one of those systems, you lose the integrated system control, for example, that Active Directory provides if you're running in an Active Directory controlled domain, being able to control the local systems across your enterprise, the local desktops, the servers from global policies and using OUs and whatnot. So, hey Dan, I see over there. It is the links are in the presentation, and there are links to everything. And if you can't find anything, just shoot me an email. I kept all the resources that I used. All right. Anybody else? And did I answer your question, Jeremy?
Yeah, no. I mean, we have maybe a minute. I guess some of the things I guess organizations are considering is from the organizational change management perspective. My users have a login and a password when they go into their desktop or network or what have you, and then having them remember multiple passwords. That would be a benefit with integrating with Active Directory, but doesn't necessarily have to be the case.
Absolutely. And Stephen, I do not have enough time to address that question about management buy-in. Please shoot me an email and I'm happy to give you the notes on how to overcome that. And it looks like we are getting signed off here. Jeremy has the honor of running the statewide multi-factor authentication system. Please hit him up if you need help with this. And if you're not looking to go the statewide route, then look into these modern integrations and also look at the stack that you already have. And they're giving me the cane, so I'm getting pulled off the stage. Good to see you guys.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Talk to you later.
Thank you.
You bet.